foreign policy. And by that, of course, we mean simply the underpinnings of contemporary American foreign policy. It remains, I think, of great interest how the purposes of the United States are defined, what theories of international politics underlie our foreign policy, and what principles tend to guide American foreign policy. Dr. Beyoghlow has agreed to talk to this topic. We're absolutely delighted that he has. He's a visiting scholar with the U.S. Department of State, and as I mentioned, often represents the State Department on occasions such as these. He's been in government, was in government service, or continues to be in government service since 1983. For 5 years, he worked as a foreign affairs officer in the Office of Counterterrorism at State. He's led diplomatic missions, and he's represented the United States at international fora. He has, since 1992, been professor of international relations and national security at the Marine Corps. That's one of the most wonderful Freudian slips I've ever made. I rather like that. But I didn't mean to say the Mean Corps. I meant to say the Marine Corps. He also is a professor at UVA, adjunct professor, and at George Mason as well. His Master of Arts degree is from Tufts University in cooperation with the Fletcher School, PhD in political science from the University of California at Berkeley. The topic, I think, is of enormous interest. We're delighted that he's agreed to address it, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Kamal Beyoghlow.
It's really a great pleasure to be here this afternoon. This is a very important topic, one that I speak to all the time across the country. On many occasions, I get invited to go and speak to different audiences across the country, especially at universities and colleges, and I look forward to debating some of the issues that I'm going to be raising today. You will notice right away that I don't really have a prepared text in the sense I'm not going to read my text. I will be referring to my notes, of course, but I prefer not to read my text and just have eye contact with my audience. I've done that all my life, literally, and I find it much more helpful to me to try to assess, in essence, your reaction to the comments and suggestions I'm going to be making. Although some of them are going to be controversial, I just want to assert to you that some of the things that I'm going to be saying this afternoon may and may not correlate specifically with current American foreign policy, but it will, at least for this audience, get us a chance to interact and really sort of debate some of the issues and concepts that make up what American foreign policy is. The title of my presentation I'd like to call American Foreign Policy at the Crossroads, because I think this is the kind of issues that I'd like to sort of talk about this afternoon, that we are truly at a crossroad in terms of deciding what kind of issues and concepts and ideas ought to be part and parcel of this very important endeavor, and that is the conduct and the making of American foreign policy. I would like to start out by telling you, in essence, I am a very strong believer in American principles, and being standing right in front of you here is a testimony to all of this. I grew up in Beirut, Lebanon, came to this country really in the 60s during the Vietnam War, and registered for the draft because I really wanted to become an American citizen, and I wanted to go to school here. The interesting thing about all of this is that I became a naturalized U.S. citizen. And one of the most interesting things that have happened to me is that I sort of had the privilege of working for the U.S. government. And in doing so, really, for someone who was born overseas and grew up, spent most of my young life there, to come to this country, become a naturalized U.S. citizen, and then, of course, be entrusted by the U.S. government with all kinds of secrets about how we do conduct things and how we do things abroad, and what makes, in essence, American foreign policy the way it is really, to me, represents a great deal of the kinds of things I want to talk about this afternoon, and that is essentially America's principles. And that's a testimony to its principles, that the principles that we have a country that has evolved as a result of the rule of law, a country that in a way very much adheres to constitutional liberalism, a country that in a way ought and should continuously regard the protection of human rights and civil rights to be above any other interests. Those are the principles that I want to address this afternoon, and I will start with this topic as I go on with my presentation. The way I divided the presentation is I'm going to talk about four challenges that face American foreign policy today. And in talking about those challenges, ladies and gentlemen, I will weave, of course, the current policies and interests that we face abroad, and maybe perhaps assess the current foreign policy of the United States. Okay, the first challenge that I think is very important, especially for this audience, because in a college sort of environment, we all like to present things in a very logical manner so that people could really follow you and know exactly what you're talking about. And of course, that opens up the debate later on. And I asked the question, what are really America's principles and what are America's interests? The first thing that I ask myself when I think about American foreign policy is that what are these principles that sort of motivate the policy itself, and what are the interests? And I myself would like to adhere to the notion that really the American foreign policy should first and foremost create a balance between interests and principles, that we ought not to, in essence, get involved in world politics and embark on foreign policy that it basically looks at the world in terms of material gain only, or in terms of specifically interests that have to do with economic gain or economic interests. In other words, we ought not to be advancing vital interests, i.e. in equating vital interests with economic interests only. But there are a lot of other important vital interests that we face in the world, and most importantly is, in my judgment, the safeguarding of our principles as a nation. And when I talk about principles, I'm talking about really the notions that makes us what we are as Americans, the kinds of things that, the privileges that were given to me as a young man growing up in this country, but more importantly, the opportunities that this country has given me and the trust that has been bestowed on me as a result of my loyalty to it, and so on and so forth. And what are some of these principles? What principles of compassion, principles of pity, principles essentially that have to do with the rule of law, principles that have to do with the protection of human rights and civil rights, no matter what the stakes are. And those becomes really important. The rule of law, of course, essentially says in any kind of foreign policy that ought to be what we ought to be embarking on, ladies and gentlemen, it has to do with moral values. That basically these core values, whatever applies to us applies to everybody else, and that's really what the rule of law means. It becomes very important. It really embodies also other things, so I'm still talking about the questions of principles. Questions of moral courage, for example. Moral courage, to me, very much like the rule of law, what applies to us ought to apply to any other country in the world, and vice versa, is doing the right thing, having the moral courage to stand up when you say hundreds and thousands of people being killed, thrown out of their homes, hundreds and thousands of people being raped and killed and murdered and tortured, that we stand up and say enough is enough and we're not going to take it anymore, and we really are going to do something about it, even though we have limited resources and we can't really get involved in every single aspect of foreign policy that pushes us in this direction. But at least we will continue to stick to our principles, because that is very important. That's really what is important to us, and that's really what is going to be enduring in the long term. Other aspects of the principles, and that's again, I'm talking about the challenges. The challenges we face all the time is trying to create that balance between principles on one hand and interests on the other, specifically economic interests. I would say adherence to democratic values are the kinds of things that I've talked about already, and that is in essence the protection of civil human rights around the world. And to ensure in essence that what happens in the long term, we are going to ensure that those rights and those are going to be protected at any cost. So in the long term then, what we have to be thinking about when we think about principles is that not only we ought to adhere to these core values that make us as Americans, which is a big challenge for us, but also to ensure that we don't get involved in issues and conflicts around the world without first and foremost embarking on what I would consider to be conflict resolutions and confidence building measures. That's really what diplomacy is all about. In other words, we do not want to go ahead, intervene in every single problem in the world before we attempt very hard to try to apply certain kinds of conflict resolution measures that will bring about contending parties and contending justices to the negotiating table, and ultimately may save American lives and also American resources. That is really important. But what we see happening here, as far as American foreign policy is concerned in the long term, is that we are being confronted continuously, it seems to me, and we have for the last 7, 8 years now, of sending troops abroad, and we will continue to do so, of course, because that sometimes is necessary to safeguard, more and more lives. In the way of peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace enforcing, and so on. And those decisions, we will notice that in the long term, they are going to be political decisions. Political decisions are important because one that would require in the long term resources that have not been allocated to be allocated to try to deal with these issues. And we will face other challenges in this realm as well when we begin to sort of think about sending troops abroad and at the same time ensuring that those troops are going to meet certain deadlines and that we have to withdraw them. Because that creates a major problem with the issue of principles. Because if we are sending troops abroad to do a job on behalf of the American government and the American people, because you cannot really separate American foreign policy from domestic policy, then we ought to ensure that the strategy drives the deadline, not the other way around. And it seems to me that is a major challenge facing us in this realm as well. Having said that, ladies and gentlemen, then the next important question that one asks about this conflict between principles on one hand and interests is the question of rationale. One of the biggest questions that I face on a daily basis on what to do with American foreign policy, how I should be thinking about it. Well, I must ask myself the question, what is really the rationale for American foreign policy? And the answer to that is there isn't any. There isn't any one single rationale for American foreign policy. Therefore, you can't really in the practice of it, in the making of foreign policy, in the conduct of foreign policy, there is really no cookie-cutting sort of approach to it. There's no cookie-cutter approach to foreign policy. So what happens, in other words, every situation in the world is going to be very different. The rationale for sending troops to Bosnia, for example, or Kosovo are going to be very different from the rationale for committing troops to East Timor, or to Haiti, or to the Middle East, or to Africa, and so on and so forth. So the rationale becomes really important, and that becomes a very important challenge, because ultimately, instead of having one kind of strategy all-encompassing, driving American foreign policy, we end up having a series of strategies really, in a way, tailored to regional problems. Okay, so and what happens in the long term is that the regional problems tend to be very unique to regional areas, and the rationale for American foreign policy is going to differ from one region to the other. That's the first important issue. The second important issue, which I think is it gets to the heart of the problem, which has to do with the second challenge, ladies and gentlemen. That is the challenge, in essence, that we face in terms of where are we going following the Cold War. During the Cold War, as you very well know, really the conflict was a bilateral conflict. The United States essentially pitted itself against the Soviet Union. Today, the United States, as it makes and conducts its foreign policy, is no longer alone. This is a multilateral world. What that really means, essentially, you have a lot of actors have emerged, in essence, many important players have emerged. I think of China, I think essentially of India, I think of sort of countries in Latin America and elsewhere that have really, are going to challenge, in essence, the predominance of American and Russian powers in the world. So as a result of that, you have more actors emerging. But more importantly, what is really driving the foreign policy today and will continue to into the 21st century are the more complex issues that really have emerged as a result of the end of the Cold War. In the Cold War, the issues were very simple. I mean, it was an ideological conflict. Today, the conflicts revolve around ethnic, national, and religious, and most of these conflicts tend to overlap with one another. The United States and I speak here from experience, finds itself continuously really caught in the crosswinds, essentially, of all these overlapping sort of problems or concepts, which I think is very, very important. And this gives the impression that the United States really is, in a way, losing it, or that the ship of foreign policy is adrift. The point is, the Clinton administration inherited, in my judgment, very complex issues. And because it continued to focus primarily on the domestic agenda, it had to work extremely hard to try to insulate the domestic agenda, especially the domestic economy, from those kinds of problems. And I'm going to reiterate this problem in a minute. And I think that is really very important in the long term. How do you go about continue to insulate? And I think that's the challenge that the Clinton administration had faced. And that's the challenge we face as policymakers in the foreign policy area. How do you continue to insulate a thriving, very prosperous sort of economy, very stable economy, very stable political system from the kinds of problems that appear to be taking place all over the world at a time, ladies and gentlemen, when the world has become increasingly interdependent and more global. That key, catchy word, globalization. Globalization, of course, increased interdependence between nations, but it also contributed to some degree to the increased power of certain nations at the expense of other nations. So in other words, there are unintended consequences of globalization. And globalization, just to be honest with you, has not been that an agreeable kind of issue to many countries around the world. It had unintended negative consequences on many countries in the world, and this is why we have problems within the World Trade Organizations, and this is why we have problems within the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and a lot of other places like that. Okay, so having said that then, that the challenges we face in the American foreign policy realm, and that's what the Clinton administration honestly has faced, is how do you avoid falling in the crosswinds? If you ever live in California and travel in the Mojave Desert, as I have, because California is my home state, you'll be driving down the road in the Mojaves and you see all these signs, watch out for the crosswinds. And it's really a wonderful term, because what that really means, essentially, if you're driving down the road in the Mojave Desert and you're caught in the crosswinds, your car is going to be destabilized. So the challenge we face then, in this sense, how do you ensure that you continue to have a stable political and economic system, at the same time the national system, in essence, is really in total turmoil, that you're not caught into this crosswind that is extremely important. But at the same time, the subset of challenges to this, of course, is to have to make a decision. Do you want to be an isolationist? Do you want to have, total engagement in the world, or do you want to sort of be assertive and get involved in every sort of problems that takes place in the world? And I think that is really the current debate that's going on within the foreign policy realm. So what is the basis of this crosswind, ladies and gentlemen? From my experience, of course, I've already mentioned it in general. I said, in essence, what the crosswind is all about is sort of we have increased political conflicts emerging from ethnic, national, and religious issues. Okay? And they are very important. They tend to move you in different directions, because those kinds of overlapping problems tend to generate extreme emotions and passions that culminate in many different sort of issues and problems. Okay, what are some of the problems? Because the important thing to keep in mind, the current foreign policy of the United States is revolving around the notion, how do you deal with these issues? I.e., I call them threats. Really, if you really want to know what goes on with the foreign policy around today, you have to think about the different threats that are facing the United States. So the Clinton administration and the State Department and the national security community, the national intelligence community, spends tremendous amount of time deciding what to do with the threat. Now, it was easy, of course, during the Cold War to identify what the threat was. The threat was the Soviet Union and its cronies. Whoever supported the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe or any other sort of group around the world that sort of had a similar ideological affinity to the Soviet Union, it was easy to identify them. It's much more difficult today to identify the players and actors that have a lot to do with those kinds of threats. So it's much easier to try to put fires out. So the administration, in a way, spends a great deal of time just putting out fires. This administration has done a great job, essentially, trying to put out fires. What it has really essentially failed in the long term to achieve is, what do you do after you put out the fire? It's almost like the fire brigade comes to your house because there is a fire, and they demolish the entire house, right? They have all this water damage and they break down the doors and windows and so on. But then who's going to reconstruct that house? Who's going to reconstruct that apartment? And that's what we haven't followed on. And this administration is not really interested as much in the notion of nation building. In fact, it shies away from nation building, which is a very important concept when it comes down, in essence, to providing in the long term security and stability. Because this kind of administration, this kind of foreign policy thrives on stability and security of the world. In other words, you can't conduct foreign policy when you have a lot of turmoil going on in the world. And you can't really conduct foreign policy unless you can try, not eliminate, but try to contain the different threats that the United States faces around the world. So what are some of these threats? The first one, of course, is terrorism. Okay? Terrorism isn't good for business, but after all, America's business is business. If America's business is business, then terrorism tends to destabilize the world. It creates, fear. It creates turmoil. It has a spillover effect between nations. A classic example of what's going on in Kashmir today. Kashmir today is really in the next flashpoint, as far as I'm concerned. It's going to be a major problem. I wouldn't even call China and Taiwan the next flashpoint as much as I would say South Asia, India and Pakistan over Kashmir is a really hotly debated issue. Passions are really strong there. Emotions are, every single thing we're talking about here is very much part of what's going on in Kashmir today. So terrorism is has a destabilizing impact not only on the United States, but on our friends and allies as well. And if we are thinking about in the long term what that really means, instability, any kinds of things that really sort of is going to create instability around the world is going to be inimical to American business. So all of these things are sort of somewhat related. But anyway, what are some of the issues? Terrorism is a very important one. And today, one of the hottest things that's going on out of terrorism is what do you do with organizations that are really, in a way, front organizations around the world raising tremendous amount of money. One of the hottest issues concerning terrorism today isn't really the active terrorism per se as much as it is who's actually raising what billions of dollars to try to recruit, to try to train, to try to buy equipment, especially in the area of nuclear, chemical, biological weapon for the next terrorist act. Okay, so there's a lot of emphasis today in the foreign policy area. Tremendous energy and resources are being expended on tracking down, in essence, the movement of money, billions of dollars on a daily basis as a result of the information technology, the information age from one state to the other across the world. And it's becoming a very difficult thing. Why? Because really sort of financial institutions such as central banks, international financial institutions have never really been involved in the fight against terrorism, but now they're being asked to do so, and of course, because they have a different agendas, they tend to have problems with that issue. So we've got that problem of terrorism. We've got the problem of so-called the cyber terrorism also. I mean, the people argue in essence that what's going on in the world today is that a lot of groups who have in the past engaged in acts of terrorism are having their own websites. I mean, just like you guys have websites, they have websites too. And the websites raise money, they recruit people, they mobilize people. So we're concerned about that. We know at least 15 groups around the world have websites today, and they're recognized by many different places around the world. So these are the challenges you face in the terrorism field. Then you've got China and Russia. What do you do with China and Russia? You want to continue to encourage them to create economic and political reform. You want to have them essentially democratize. But our ability to reshape them is going to be very limited. Why? Because they also have their own internal problems to deal with. So we can push essentially China and Russia to encourage democratization, but in the long term, they have to do something from within, and because their ability to confront us either by their weakness or by their strength is going to remain around for long periods of time. The proliferation of nuclear, chemical, biological weapons, another important threat that we face. So the American foreign policy works very, very hard, spends tremendous resources trying to track down, in essence, the movement of supplies around the world, precursors, training equipment, any kinds of things that have to do with nuclear, chemical, biological weapons, and missile technologies, the next important thing. China likes not only to build missiles, but it also likes to sell them, and so are the North Koreans. So we've got problems, in essence, how you go about containing the spread of missile technology around the world, because missiles, again, are very destabilizing. What about the issue of trade wars and globalization? I've already alluded to the notion globalization. Although it has a very positive impact on one hand, it has a it also has positive income, but also has a very negative impact, and that's really important. And what do you do essentially with global countries that want to compete but don't have the opportunity to do so because of the disparity of power around the world? So that becomes an issue that we're very much concerned with. And the president, in his last of the Union message, argued in a way that really globalization should be wedded with compassion, that we ought to be concerned about the little guy, the person who really can't compete in the world, and try to create a more equitable distribution of income and resources around the world. And that's really what globalization ought to look like, a globalization with humanity, with humanitarian issues. And I think that becomes really important. We are being challenged today also within this realm of challenges about the peace process. The peace process in Ireland sort of seems to be wavering. We don't really know where it's going. It's a great deal of uncertainty that takes place, but that's a great deal of the resources of American foreign policy goes in that direction, to ensure that democratic processes are put in place in Northern Ireland, and that in essence both the Catholics and the Protestants in essence resolve their problems. And the same thing applies to the Middle East. I mean, you've got a problem there that is very protracting, although the Palestinians are, the Palestinian track and the Israeli track is working okay, and hopefully by next September things will be resolved. The Syrian track is still very precarious and very, very dangerous if it's not resolved anytime soon. So the United States is very much involved in attempting to broker some kind of peace agreement between the Syrians and the Israelis, because that could be really the spoiler point in the whole peace process in that region of the world. Then you've got the issue of international criminal organizations, syndicates, drugs. All of these things remain very challenging to the United States, and take tremendous amount of resources and efforts to try to address. So therefore, the bottom line then to this discussion, to the challenge number 2, ladies and gentlemen, is that we've got so many different kind of complex issues and problems that have to be dealt with, and they are being dealt with all simultaneously, all at the same time, and sometimes you really can't do justice to any of them at the same time. So you've got those kinds of challenges that faces you in the long term. Now, of course, that aspect of the foreign policy is not without any its critics. As you very well know, Henry Kissinger is a major critic of the current administration and current foreign policy, and he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post recently in which he argued in a way that the current foreign policy of the United States is adrift. And the reason he says that, which is very interesting, is because there isn't really any coherent way to connect all the different U.S. policies, foreign policies, to one another. So which was a very interesting point on his part. And what he basically was envisioning a strategy that would work much like the strategy that worked during the period of containment, i.e. after the Second World War. And having talked about the complexity of the issues that this administration has inherited and the kinds of issues that we in the foreign policy establishment have to deal with on a daily basis, I am honestly not so sure that a workable strategy can encompass all these threats, all these problems, all at the same time. It's going to be extremely difficult to do. And this is why I have said the way American foreign policy is made and conducted is based on the notion that it has to be dealt on a regional basis. Every region has its own threats, its own problems, and all these threats and all these problems essentially tend to be unique. So what you have to do really in the long term is establish strategies unique, not just one strategy, but many strategies around the world, because strategies are important because it tells you exactly what you want to do as far as these problems are concerned. And of course, after that, you're going to have to develop a policy, and the policy tells you how you're going to go about implementing the strategy. So strategy and policy must be matching one another. And what appears to be on the surface right now across the board when you speak in very general terms, that there is really a mismatch between strategy and policy. And I think this is something we can debate here, but you can also debate it in the classroom as well. Is there a mismatch between U.S. strategy and U.S. policy anywhere around the world? Do we really put our interests always ahead of our principles? Do we talk a lot about principles, we don't really adhere to them when it comes down to economic conditions? For example, we're willing to do something for Kosovo and Bosnia. Why? Because the rationale for Kosovo and Bosnia essentially have major implications for us, because it has to do with the transatlantic alliance, it has to do in essence with NATO, it has to do basically with spillover effect on regional conflicts that could really destroy NATO altogether. But we won't do any of that in Rwanda. In retrospect, of course, we're putting our principles behind our interests. And that I think is the major challenge that we tend to face, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes down to the whole question. Challenge number 3, because I'm only throwing these at you because they become really important in the making of foreign policy. Okay, it has to do with leadership. America's leadership today is almost paramount. We have come out of this the Cold War currently strong and prosperous and respected and in a way at peace with the world across the board. We're not directly involved in any kind of major wars as we did, of course, during the Vietnam War. But it's a very important kind of period for us because it basically says that leadership is really sort of the kinds of things that the world is seeking today as a result of the kinds of things I've addressed. And we are bound to lead. I think Joe Nye at Harvard University wrote a wonderful book called Bound to Lead, and his argument has always been that the United States is really in a position to lead the world right now much better than any other time in the history of this country, and that becomes really important. I tend to feel that when it comes down to American foreign policy, there really is no substitute for American leadership. So we need to, in essence, lead and create in this type of leadership a certain kind of model for the world to follow. And basically, if we are the model of the world, and we really have to expect other countries in essentially to follow suit when it comes down to the making and the conduct of American foreign policy. But whatever model we present, it ought to have that balance, and that's really what I've argued here this afternoon. It has to have that balance, and that's basically between principles and interests, between what we say we want to do and we really actually do in the long term. And that becomes an important aspect of the whole debate, the current debate that's taking place in the United States, and is essentially what kind of policy will achieve the leadership. Should we be isolationists? Should we turn into the country? And if we argue that point, of course, we will be arguing in a way that the United States is totally self-sufficient. Every single person in this room understands that the economy of this country is great, but it's not self-sufficient because globalization and interdependence really has set in. We no longer have a system of imperialism. We no longer have a system of colonialism in which you have total dependencies. We have interdependencies going on around the world today. So isolation really is not a very practical thing to do. I mean, ask the entrepreneur down there in the Silicon Valley in California, and he wants to sell products all over the world. And ask the farmer essentially in Iowa, and he wants to sell his goods and services everywhere around the world. They all know basically that we really, in order for the economy to expand, and in order for America's business to conduct business, it ought to, in essence, be engaged in world politics. And that's really why, in the early years of the Clinton administration, we began talking about a policy or a strategy of engagement and enlargement. These two terms were being used. And of course, those were supposedly were the brainchild of Professor Lake, who argued in a way that the United States can survive in a post-Cold War environment by engaging with other countries in the world, but drawing them in, encouraging essentially elements of democracy and democratic activities within their realm, encouraging political reform, helping out essentially develop sort of a prosperous economic systems, and ultimately provide an opportunity to really to become democratic, because the premise for that argument was that democratic systems do not make wars on other democratic systems, okay? There's a major debate that's going on in this realm, and it becomes very important. However, our friends and allies around the world objected to the world enlargement, because enlargement implied a sense of imperialism, that the United States is going to imperialize the world somehow again. It's going to be the new imperialist country. It wants to enlarge its democracy. It's going to impose its democracy on other countries. And as you very well know, the French were very much perturbed by that and argued in a way that the United States sort of engages in cultural imperialism, those kinds of sort of issues. Why? Because we send all our movies over there, we send all our CDs and music over there, and then we're trying to change their culture. And of course, so the term was dropped. So we now talk about engagement. The issue, though, in this number 3 challenge that we face, how far do you want to engage? How far do you want to engage to create the kind of opportunities that's going to achieve your objectives in the long term, your end states? Do you engage, for example, with Iran, a country that really misbehaves all the time on the international community, a country that in many ways continues to support terrorism, continues to engage in the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, continues to go after its dissidents. Even though they have had free elections, they've had some kind of some semblance of democracy mushrooming in that country. you're going to have to sort of decide what is the best thing for you to do. Do you engage, in essence, Iraq? We know very well we don't want to engage Iraq. So the alternative to that in the foreign policy realm is to try to isolate countries that misbehave and try to reward countries in a way that are willing to change. Of course, that gives the impression of a double standard, right? Because after all, if we don't want to engage the Iranians, we don't want to engage the Iraqis, and the reason we don't want to do it because they are weak states, why is it we're doing it with China? Well, why are we doing it with Russia? Because the stakes are much higher, to be honest with you. In China and Russia, the stakes are much higher. Therefore, we engage those bigger countries. We do what we can, right? We can't isolate China and Russia. You can't really, in a way, contain 1 billion people in China. I think my colleague who's going to come up next will tell you all about it. It's a very difficult thing to do. So realism sets in. So now we're talking about international politics. We're talking about world politics, not about the role of power in international relations. And it basically means, in essence, that those elements of powers become really important. Economic, political, diplomatic, informational. They have a lot of stake as to how our foreign policy is going to be conducted vis-a-vis small and bigger countries. And I think that is a major challenge we're going to have to face as we evolve into, as the policy evolves into the 21st century. I think that is really important. But whatever we do in terms of this third challenge by way of the debate, I'll speak only for 5 more minutes. Whatever we do by way of this challenge, ladies and gentlemen, it is very important to realize that military force, the use of the military as an instrument becomes really important in the conduct of foreign policy. That basically the military side of the house and the diplomatic side of the house must go hand in hand. Much as I've said earlier, the conduct of American foreign policy and the protection of civil and human rights must go hand in hand as well. So that is a very important concept here we're talking about, because ultimately how American foreign policy is going to evolve in the long term has a lot to do with balancing one with the other. It's not a very easy thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to do in the long term. And I think that is really key. So having said that then, what is needed in order for us to assert leadership in the world, which is the third challenge I've talked about? In my judgment, international consensus, to be honest with you. I think the United States works very, very hard to try to forge in a way international consensus of like-minded nations. Even those countries that don't agree with us necessarily on everything, we are willing to work with them to try to bring them around, in essence, to achieve at least some kind of consensus on broader issues, on the issues that I've talked about earlier. So that becomes important. So when we talk about international consensus, American foreign policy, whether we're talking about fighting terrorism or whether we're talking about fighting the weapons of mass destruction, whether we're talking about essentially furthering the cause of democracy around the world, has to be based on international cooperation. Well, the bottom line to everything I've said so far this afternoon, in the half an hour or so I've been talking, is that we can't do it by ourselves any longer. We can't be the Lone Rangers any longer. The challenges we face are very protracted and very, very difficult and very complex. So international cooperation is very, very important to move the foreign policy in the direction you want to move it to, and that is in essence to create at least a semblance of order of some sort. After all, many of you being professors and college-educated individuals realize that the kind of world we live in today is a world of anarchy. A world of anarchy that has no centralized government. So the best thing you could do in a world of anarchy is try as much as possible to manage crises from one to the other. So the management of crises will most surely involve international cooperations of countries around the world. Some like-minded and some are not. This is why we're trying essentially to work very hard on getting Russia to try to go along with the START 1 and 2, and now we're going to try to think and talk about START 3, which is, all of these things are really important issues, and they further, in essence, our values, core values, and our principles in the long term of maintaining stability and security around the world, because the foreign policy not based on security and stability, ladies and gentlemen, is doomed to failure. The fourth challenge we face, which is the last one, which is really important, is the question of the need in foreign policy, especially in U.S. foreign policy, of bipartisan consensus. So if we talk about the international community and we're talking about international consensus, we need to achieve consensus here amongst ourselves, trying to achieve very difficult sort of goals and objectives in the long term, end states. It's very hard in itself, but to try to sort of move in different directions as to how we ought to approach the problem, what we ought to do with that consensus, also sends a the wrong message abroad that the United States is not in order, that basically there's major divisions amongst us, that Congress in essence wants to go on a tangent to try to make foreign policy at the expense of the presidential powers. And it sends a wrong message as far as leadership is concerned. So the challenge basically that we face in this number 4th issue is that who makes American foreign policy? Who should be making American foreign policy? As you very well know, foreign policy making has always been prerogative of the president. Congress, though, as a result of the fact that domestic issues are really driving foreign policy more and more in the post-Cold War environment, has taken the lead on a lot of issues. I can only mention a few of them. You know, the rejection of the test ban treaty is a classic example of that. The involvement with the Ilan Gonzalez case is a classic example of that, because I tend to see Cuba as a domestic problem, not a foreign policy problem. It's a domestic problem. All of these things really become very important. So who's really making foreign policy today? Is it Congress? Is it the President? Is it the National Security Council? I mean, these are really important issues. Does the State Department make foreign policy anymore, or does the State Department only conduct foreign policy, i.e. to implement decisions that have been already made by others, whether we're talking about the National Security Council or whether they are being made essentially by Congress? Those are the kinds of issues you really want to debate, not only here after my presentation, but also in the classroom, because they become very important as we embark on the 21st century. Seldom you have very good choices when it comes down really to making a foreign policy decision. When the stakes are very high, when the stakes are extremely high, your choices are going to be very limited. And from my experience as having worked in the policy area, I have experienced this repeatedly, and that is essentially you're always picking up choices and options that aren't really very attractive. So as the situations become really tough and as the stakes get higher, it becomes very, very difficult to actually pick from very good choices. So therefore, American foreign policy then ultimately becomes, in the making of foreign policy, the challenge becomes as follows. You very seldom have very good choices. All your outcomes are flawed, to be honest with you, and all decisions are compromises. Think about that. I repeat that. You know, when it comes down to the making of foreign policy, ultimately, in the next few years, seldom you're going to have very good choices. All the outcomes are likely to be very flawed, and all the decisions are likely to be compromises. These are really important issues, and I think I leave them with you for you to be thinking about. But let me come to the grand finale. The challenge we face in the conduct and the making of American foreign policy today are as follows. How do you go about reconciling, power of the United States, the fact that we have come out from the Cold War triumphant, very powerful, very prosperous, with great deal of, some people argue, maybe arrogance as well. Sort of read the Ugly American. It reminds me of a lot of wonderful things about what I'm talking about. Where do we want to go? Do we want to achieve sort of power, or do we want to achieve long-term security? Because if you one and the other, in essence, could create a great deal of problems for us in the long term. Are you supposed to be creating a balance between your position of power and your long-term security on the other? I think that's one of the challenge. How do you go about reconciling strategy, as I said earlier, with policy? How do you reconcile leadership with hegemony? How do you reconcile principles with material interests? Today, ladies and gentlemen, America basically faces very difficult options and very difficult choices. There are out there forces of integration involving international regimes, interdependencies, democracy, conflict resolutions, confidence-building measures. These are wonderful things to be part and parcel of America's policy. On the other hand, the United States faces forces of disintegration as well. Ethnic, national, religious rivalries that generate the kinds of issues and complex issues that you have to deal with on a daily basis. The bottom line, it's very, very difficult to make and conduct and implement America's foreign policy. However, the thing I want to leave you with, if people out there cooperate with us and are willing to really change, American foreign policy in the 20th century will revolve around the notion that we are willing, to be honest with you, and that's my perspective on it, we're willing to deal with the devil if he only mends his ways. Thank you very much.
Well, we certainly think that was an awful topic to give to anybody, to cover all of American foreign policy. But I think this was a very, very interesting presentation. And in my modest view, a not inaccurate reflection of the scope of the current administration's discussion and thinking about foreign policy. The floor is now open for questions. I'm going to have to repeat the questions because for the benefit of our camera and perhaps for those who don't hear the question. Yes. Would you comment on the Clinton administration policy toward Colombia on the question of international narcotics trade?
Well, Colombia is a very difficult country. I mean, it's sort of a difficult country to deal with, mainly because drug trafficking in the long term, I think we ought to begin with the premise. The drug trafficking in the long term causes major problems for us in the United States, both in terms of social, health, financial, and other sort of aspects of the policy. The United States, as you very well know, had sort of presented in a way a plan for Colombia, and it's a comprehensive plan, it's a comprehensive strategy that attempts in a way to try to get the Colombian government to ensure the kinds of principle we talked about earlier, that is to apply the rule of law as much as it can, and we're trying to do a lot of that right now, mainly because in the past we've really neglected that area altogether. Sort of now we're trying to get the Colombian government not only to fight drugs, but also at the same time to try to enlist support of key security organizations in Colombia, the police, the military, and so on, to adhere to the rule of law and to the protection of human rights and civil rights, especially when there is an arrest, because in the past there's been a tremendous amount of abuses. You know, the problem with the drug issue is, of course, it's protracted. Much like terrorism, it's going to continue to evolve. It's always going to be here. Really, there's no way you can eradicate it. I think the administration, I believe I'm accurate on this, in a way, inherited this problem, of course, from other presidents. This is not a problem, presidential problem that is unique to the current administration. And the issue has always been, what is it that you really are willing to do to try to at least contain the threat that emanates from the drug cartels? There really aren't any simple answers, but I think the fact that you approach it as war is problematic, because we have tried to do this with the war on poverty, as you very well know, in the 60s, and we really never succeeded in it. And we talked about the war on drugs, and what kind of results we ended up with. And we for a while we talked about the war on terrorism, and that's another sort of a heady kind of issue that we got involved in. I think ultimately the plan might work, but it's not going to be 100% foolproof. I think it's a step in the right direction, but it's a very small step. But the fight against drugs is almost like the same thing against the fight against terrorism and against weapons of mass destruction. You really sort of look at success one very short steps at a time, to be honest with you. You can't assess it all together at the same time as a great success. We just have to wait and see. But it's a protracted problem, and it's always going to be there. The question is, the challenge we face is essentially how best you manage it.
The question is the U.S. military the appropriate institution for the new problems we face?
I think in my discussion this afternoon, I sort of really stressed the fact that we ought to be doing a lot more about ensuring that we have conflict resolution measures being put in place at first. That we use diplomacy first and foremost to try to get others to work with us more, instead of just simply offering, in essence, American troops all the time. I think sort of it's wrong from the beginning, and I think this administration has been very cautious about that, in ensuring, in essence, that American troops are not going to be used first and foremost in resolving problems. And the same thing in Kosovo. As you know, in Kosovo and Bosnia, we waited for the Europeans to do something about it. When they weren't really forthcoming, the United States had to come and reassert its leadership. So I wouldn't say, in essence, we're doing too much in this realm. Kosovo, of course, we're sending troops for peacekeeping operations under the auspices of the UN. The same thing with Bosnia and NATO. So we are willing to work with international organizations to try to resolve some of these problems without really sort of putting American troops' lives at harm's way. I think, but the important thing to keep in mind about this issue, because this is a very important issue, that if we decide, though, to send American troops abroad, that ought to be the last resort. And the most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, I really feel very strongly about that. I know most of my colleagues in the foreign policy establishment also feel the same way. We ought to give them the resources to do the job and do it right.
The question is the IMF up to the job with respect to poverty in so much of the world?
I think the IMF and the World Bank, of course, they do two different things, as you very well know. I like to think of the IMF as being the fire brigade, and I like to think of the World Bank as the construction brigade. Maybe we can learn a lot, in essence, from these two institutions in terms of how we ought to be doing things abroad. Across the board, you have to remember the IMF and the World Bank basically were international organizations that emerged as a result of the Cold War, and that's an important thing. But of course, they've really evolved, and they evolved to a point where although the political dynamics of them is very much part and reflects very much part of parcel of what goes on in the international community, i.e. it reflects world powers. Those who have the powers, of course, determine in essence the decision outcomes of these organizations. Those two organizations have done a fabulous job over the last 5-6 years right now to try to bridge that gap between the rich and the poor nations. I mean, the IMF and the World Bank involved in all kinds of sort of developmental programs all over the world. The thing with the IMF that has drawn a lot of criticism is the fact a lot of times the IMF engineers and scientists tend to be oblivious to political issues, and I think that's really a very important question, because what that really means in essence that scientists and engineers, they go to these countries to assess the economic situation in those countries, and they tend to in a way put in place austere measures that may have major political and social implications or economic implications for the countries. So from that perspective, those countries have always sort of complained that the IMF is not really sensitive, or the World Bank, they're not sensitive to the needs of the local communities. But I think they've come a long way, and they're really trying to be, trying to do a better job in the long term. I know the president, for example, I know the foreign policy establishment has been working extremely hard to ensure the equitable distribution of income and resources. But this process is going to take a long time because, as I said, things aren't going to change very quickly, since the World Bank and the IMF really reflect, in a way, power and wealth in the world. And those countries that have more power and wealthier countries are going ultimately to have control over the decision-making process. But I think in the long term, there's a more sensitivity towards the smaller countries and poorer countries in the world by these organizations. And I think they're pouring more effort and resources into trying to bridge that gap between the rich and the poor states.
What are the roles of international organizations in what you describe as a condition of anarchy?
The United States could do a lot, and I think we are doing a lot as far as international organizations are concerned. The problem essentially is the American people basically do not really trust international organizations per se, except for maybe a handful of them. Maybe the NATO, which is really the most respected organization as far as the American people are concerned. The UN continues to suffer a question of image, more so than anything else. But international organizations are really important because they really deflect a great deal on the fact that the United States can do it all by itself by way of resources and by way of capabilities. And it's a question of empowering those international organizations to do the kinds of things that they really need to do in way of peacekeeping, peace operations, peace enforcement around the world, but more importantly on the issues of developmental questions. There's no doubt in my mind that we have limited resources in this country, even though we're the most prosperous and more powerful country in the world. The question is we really need to be able to spread the responsibilities, the burden as I like to call it, to other countries around the world. And the best way to do it basically is through international organizations, or even through bilateral sort of means. And our relations with the Saudis could really help a third country develop, sort of deal with its developmental problems, or our relations with France or Britain or whatever it is. We can work together much closer to try to alleviate the suffering and the problems of the world. So to be more specific, I mean, so we ought to sort of do the kinds of things that we need to do for international organizations, more importantly, to try to train the proper kind of cadres to do better, more effective peacekeeping operations, to try in a way to get into the international organizations, other countries, to take responsibility for peacekeeping before we jump in. Give them the chance, give them the resources to do it, because you can't conduct foreign policy without resources. And I think that's the problem that we face, even with our committing our own troops abroad, that we try, a lot of times we send our troops abroad, but we really don't give them enough resources to do the job and do it very well. And what happens, you end up getting mission creep, of course. The mission just stagnates, as what happened in Somalia, or you end up putting them in harm's way without your intending to do so. So I think there's a lot of things. We can train international organizations to do more things. We can share information with them that could really help them develop their own systems to try to resolve problems around the world. So there are a lot of opportunities out there for the United States to do it. The question is, how do you go about selling that idea to the American people? In the short term, it's sellable. The American people would like to have take on less and less direct burden in terms of the responsibility around the world. But in the long term, the American people are very shy and very weary of having, for example, international organization taking the lead, because a lot of times that would international organizations tend to do things slightly differently from us because of the different cultures that countries tend to display.
Won't an Arab-Israeli settlement make a major dent in terrorism?
It makes a small dent, because based on my discussion this afternoon, what I really said, in essence, terrorism is evolving, much like American foreign policy is evolving. And that's why it's very difficult to capture the essence of American foreign policy, or to capture, in my judgment, the essence of terrorism and the fight against terrorism. It will take some part of it, but you have to keep in mind, as I said, in the post-Cold War environment, the conflict isn't anymore an ideological conflict. It embodies in us a lot of other sort of conflicts. It's ethnic, it's national, it's religious. And we have noticed, to be honest with you, in direct answer to your question, we've noticed somewhat a shift, and of course it reinforces the point you're trying to make, a shift from terrorist attacks and terrorist incidents and terrorist activities from the Middle East and North Africa in the past sort of year and a half now to South Asia. Sort of Afghanistan now becomes really an important area where, in essence, Turkmenistan guys, Bin Laden, international terrorist groups that really have no political affiliation of any sort. They have shifting alliances. They're very loosely knit. They go through Afghanistan, through basically South Asia. Kashmir is very hot. You've got this, on one hand, you've got these sort of nationalists, you've got the religious, you've got the ethnic sort of rivalries between the Pakistanis, of course, and the Hindus. So I would say it will reduce it, but it will never eliminate it, because in a way the problems that generate terrorism is always going to be there in a very evolving manner, and the problems of the past will evolve into something else in the future. And I think that's the way you ought to be thinking about terrorism. It's a very difficult thing to eradicate, much like drugs. It's extremely difficult to eradicate. But it doesn't mean, again, that you should not try. You should continue to try. And as I said, the essence of fighting international terrorism, international drugs, weapons of mass destruction, spread of democracy, really has a lot to do, in my judgment, with international cooperation. We wouldn't have broken the bombing in Tanzania and Nairobi without the help of the Pakistanis and the Jordanians and all these like-minded nations that really care about our interests, who are our friends and allies. It would be very, very difficult to do. In my judgment, international cooperation is very critical, but also interagency coordination. That is what we do here in the United States among the different set of players in the national security community and the national intelligence community has a lot to do with the managing and containing of terrorism. It isn't just a peace process. The peace process is going to help, no doubt about it. But the peace process, as you notice, sir, has generated also a lot of other extremists on the periphery. Bin Laden, one of the arguments Bin Laden makes essentially that the peace process is inimical to Arab interests in the long term, to Islamic interests. And so are other groups like Hamas, for example, and so like other groups like the armed Islamic group in Algeria. So yes, you're resolving it on one hand, but you're creating other problems on the other hand. And the best thing you could do is try to manage the crises, try to improve international cooperation and interagency coordination, to try to contain it as much as you can. It's a very difficult process.
Well, I'm sorry we don't have more time. I apologize to those of you who have questions remaining. And Professor Beyoghlow, you could use more time. And it's been a very, very interesting and comprehensive presentation, for which we're thoroughly in your debt. Thanks very much for being with us.